Hello, everyone. Thanks for taking the time of this afternoon and sticking with us till the end. I'm going to give some ideas of answering a question that clearly nobody has the answer to, at least yet. Yeah, let's talk about how to DAO. We already spoke about forks and DAO drama, and we covered some of the cool use cases. So, who's Aragon and what are we going to talk about today? Aragon has been building DAO infrastructure since 2016. Some of the biggest projects in the space are using our stack, including Lido, Decentraland, and Curve, for example. Just this year, we relaunched our entire stack. So we have a new protocol, new SDK, and a new app. And we've also made some meaningful steps towards becoming a DAO ourselves. So I'll talk about why are people building DAOs? What are some of the trade-offs that you would face when going through those steps? And then, also I'll be touching on what we've seen ourselves and what we've seen play out into the ecosystem as a whole. So what is a DAO? A very loaded question. And there are myriad of different definitions that circulate around the space. This is the one we sort of feel most closely connected with. So a DAO is an organization run by smart contracts on a public blockchain. So it's decentralized because of the network it's built on. So it's built on a trustless, permissionless blockchain, like the Ethereum network and Polygon and a bunch of other scaling solutions around Ethereum. It's autonomous because permissions and roles within that structure are granted through smart contracts. There isn't an admin saying who does what, or there might be. It's an option. The point is the rules are encoded in smart contracts, and it's an organization, meaning a group of agents. So far, we've mostly seen people and businesses, but hopefully soon AI. So it's a group of agents that coordinates towards a shared objective. So with that definition in mind, let's look at what's been happening in DAOs over the past, 6-7 years. It all started with an idea that Vitalik shared in one of his blog articles around DAOs and DACs, so decentralized autonomous organizations and decentralized autonomous corporations in 2014. Then just a year later, Rune and Stefan started talking about creating Maker, which is technically the oldest DAO that still exists. And it was off to a great start. And then 2016 comes across. The entire ecosystem is very excited to create this joint fund to fund development on top of Ethereum called the DAO that notoriously got hacked. And then, nobody wanted to talk about DAOs for a very long time, except us. So this is Jorge and Luis, who are the founders of our project, came together in 2016 and started building the governance infrastructure that projects like Lido and Curve are using today. 2019, another very important year for DAOs. The Moloch governance framework was born with the very important feature of rage quitting. Which allows minority token holders to exit if they don't agree with the majority decision. Philosophically, a very important mechanism. Moving on, 2020, Compound becomes the largest DAO through their liquidity incentive program. Since then, we've seen a lot of protocols DAO-ify, Uniswap, ENS, most recently Arbitrum and Optimism. We've also seen mainstream media pay attention to DAOs because of more mimetic use cases like Constitution. We've seen a lot of scaling off-chain. And we also seen the emergence of Nonce, which is one of the more interesting experiments in collective decision-making and coordination. We're collectively writing history, so we don't know what's next. But I'll try to provide a few thoughts around how you can think of structuring a DAO and why would you do it. So why are people building DAOs today? The first group I would say, is protocols and products. So a lot of the large successful projects in the space fall in that category. So it's Maker, ENS, Optimism, and a lot of others. And the idea there is the DAO controls, yes, a treasury, but it also controls an underlying protocol that creates some sort of value and brings it into the world. We have work collectives, which are like gaming guilds, like Yield Guild, as well as service provider collectives, DAO and IndieDAO being two of the more well-known names. Capital collectives is probably the most prolific use case for DAOs. So it's, let's pool our financial capital together and figure out what to do with it. We have like philanthropy cases like Unchained Fund, as well as just pure investment cases like Hydra Ventures and Flamingo. No name, but a cool logo, so you can figure out what it is. One of the more interesting things that came into existence during the euphoric bull market was what I like to call clubs and cults. Those are DAOs that are usually congregated around a persona, an idea, or an activity. So Crosshouse, they want to buy an NBA team. The other indistinct picture is the Rihanna NFT, which is like, yes, there are some royalties related to you holding the NFT, but it also is an on-chain marker that can signal the boundaries of a community. And then there is the Bored Apes that, I think fall in the clubs or cults category. But, those are like top-level markers of what is the general direction that we want to take this community forward. A more interesting question is why distribute ownership? Because distributing the governance token is, in essence, distributing ownership into a project. So we have origination, which is we're gathered here today to build something awesome together, right? And it's like a very grassroots way of thinking about DAOs. Then we have crowdfunding, which is 2017, 2018 era, a lot of ICOs. It was like basically Kickstarter, right? It was like, oh, we'll build this cool thing, give us money now, and you can use it later. And funnily enough, a lot of the projects raised a bunch of money, and then they were like, oh, we're going to go and acquire users. So what happens in 2019, 2020? Uniswap comes and, instead of raising money to acquire users, it's like, well, we can shortcut this thing. PayPal did it in the 2000s with like, here's $10 to use our product. So Uniswap did that retroactive airdrop and, revolutionized the growth hacking game in the industry. And like all those three types fall in the general category of aligning incentives between stakeholders, which is honestly the main reason DAOs are being created. Everybody is talking about the other one, which is remove central points of failure, or like bring resilience to public infrastructure, public digital infrastructure at this point. Honestly, very few projects are at a maturity where they need this, but we keep talking about it all the time because it's like the cool one to talk about. In reality, very few projects actually launch it out for that reason at this point. Probably at some point in the future, it will be an important one. So, we've had about 6-7 years of DAOs. We're going to look at what works. Huge shout out to Justine from the Optimism Foundation. She compiled this amazing database of the DAO governance library. And if we look there, most DAOs have the following characteristics. They use one token, one vote, which is, it has a lot of problems, but it's the one thing that we've seen to kind of work. They have some sort of delegation layered on top of that. They have a very empowered core team that drives the project forward. And honestly, some of them are just a multisig. They're not like a real DAO. And it works for them at their current stage of development. That's okay. So how do we DAO? None of the stuff that's coming is clear cut. I'm going to be generalizing and like making a lot of simplification. token distribution is the most important thing that someone creating a DAO would do. A lot of the problems with one token, one vote can be fixed with like more thoughtful token distribution. I was so excited about this slide, I forgot to update the visual on the first one, but like answering the question of why you are distributing ownership is a very important consideration into distributing that ownership, right? So why are we doing this? And that's going to evolve over time, right? Like if you're building meaningful public infrastructure that is going to have a lot of more valuable stuff built on top of it, like resilience would be important, but like at your current stage, why are you distributing ownership? Who are we? Which means projects usually have this like community, which is just like a blob of people. But in reality, the community is a myriad of different stakeholders. So it's important to figure out like who are our stakeholders that we want to distribute tokens to, what are sort of the actions that they've done in the past, and we expect them to do in the future, and figure out like how many tokens do we want to give them, do we want to have them vested, et cetera, et cetera. And then talking about vesting, Bitcoin took 14 years to distribute 90% of the supply. Most projects today distribute 90% in the first 4. And that's a problem. If you're building something that should last hundreds of years, maybe, you don't want to give out all the incentives in the first 3 months. So those are like important considerations to go through. Governance. You'll never do this right? Like there's going to be someone who's going to be unhappy with the governance you have at any point in time until hopefully at some point in the future you have it right. And with that in mind, the other important constraint with governance is it should be functional, right? You can't build like a governance that's very complex, realize, oh shit, this doesn't work, and then go back. So probably, start with a multisig or start with one token, one vote, and then like keep iterating, add more complexity, abstraction, functional delegations, et cetera, et cetera. Like our entire new stack is built around the premise of organizations evolve and their governance should also evolve to meet their needs at that time. This is a pro tip. You most likely need an emergency multisig, right? Like we talk about decentralization a lot. Ultimately, most big projects where there is a lot of value at stake have some sort of emergency multisig that can more often than not just like veto things, right? You see a malicious proposal like the one that Tornado suffered from, hopefully there is an emergency multisig that can veto this sort of activity. And like another example is like you have all your protocol liquidity on a DEX, that DEX is getting hacked. You don't want to have the withdrawal function tied to like a governance cycle that's multiple weeks long, right? You want to be able to like act fast. It's important to scope that emergency multisig like well, so it doesn't become a capture vulnerability, but it's very likely that you haven't thought through all the edge cases and you need one. Don't fight it, you need one. Strategy. So there are more than one way to boil an egg. Basically, a lot of projects have this like mission, vision, values thing, and that's the guiding light of the project. But what we've seen in this space is that projects that are successful at shipping, they have something more fleshed out, some form of strategy around, okay, how are we going to get there, right? And one of the important elements there is you cannot have a point in time that sees all the future trade-offs. So instead of giving a recipe, you would give a framework. So you would provide guidance on how are we thinking about certain trade-offs and certain decisions. And ideally, as you decentralize further, the community would be able to like follow and evolve that framework. Execution is king. So I can write the most beautiful and amazing strategy, and then if the team that actually ships is not bought in, it doesn't matter. right? It just serves as like, I told you so at some point down the line, but like, you need buy-in from the stakeholders that are expected to do the actual work. Which also means, I mean, ultimately you rely on a team of sorts. And then I love the picture on accountability because we're building in the open, and a lot of us as kids, took a lens and burned some ants. And that's one of the side effects of working in the open. So it's important to provide accountability. It's important to also demand it, but at the same time, you shouldn't become like a help desk. For a project to be successful at executing, probably the teams that are doing the work have to have some degree of have to use some degree of trust from that community. Managing the tensions when it comes to operations. So we had the 2021-2022 epoch of like, oh, it's a DAO. Why are you telling me what to do? Well, so the thing is, if you don't have structure, like any organization that achieves anything has some sort of a structure, right? And having that explicit is actually extremely helpful, because when you have legitimized power that's tied either to a domain where you're empowered to make decisions or to your token balance, it closes the door for a lot of like political soft power games that are ultimately more corruptible. So having a structure doesn't fight with the idea of a DAO, right? Like the ability to evolve that structure, not having it entrenched, that's what DAOs should aspire for. But it should not be complete anarchy in there, right? Compensated contribution, it's important to have some level of continuity of effort, but also just anyone can step in and contribute. We saw that this doesn't work, right? Like there were a lot of groups that were basically just going around organizations, submitting proposals, doing close to no work. They were just very good at writing proposals, and they exploited DAO. So shortcut here, have some sort of continuous payment streams to the teams that are doing continuous work, and then RFPs and proposals for discretionary projects. 2 minutes on the clock, and it's time for a rapid fire round. Okay, so there are a few other topics that come up often when we talk with aspiring DAOs. Legal, just go talk with a lawyer, maybe two, because some of them have like very extreme views. When it comes to tools, you don't want to change your entire stack just yet. A lot of infrastructure is not existent. A lot of DAO specific tools might overcomplicate your way of doing business. The most important thing is just keep that door always opened. Again, a small shill, like that premise of continuous evolution of the tools that a project uses is something that we have at the core of our new stack. On-chain versus off-chain is a very important question as well that we get a lot. Putting things on-chain implies certain security guarantees, and there is a cost to it. And like when I say there is a cost, most people think like, oh yeah, like gas fees and shit. No, there is also cognitive cost, because you have to think through the rules and boil them down into a simple enough logic that you can actually encode on-chain. And that's often very time consuming. So like a mental model I use is like putting things on-chain is kind of like insurance, right? Like if the thing is not valuable enough, probably I don't want to pay for insurance. Like I'm not going to insure my lighter, I'm going to insure my house, right? So that's like a framework to consider on versus off-chain. When it comes to community, doing an airdrop is not how you build a community. You should have a community built around stakeholders that are relevant for whatever objective you're trying to achieve. Decentralizing governance and ownership is an amplifier, but it's not a way to build a community. And lastly, treasury. Work with a professional, or at least get some advice from a professional. This is another element where you would always be wrong. You would either have too much of your own native token in your treasury. We saw a lot of projects go down during the correction. Or you have too little of your native token and like your treasury is going to be too big for you to manage effectively. Thank you. Right on time.